I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
On May 25, 1961, John F. Kennedy made an address to Congress on how he wants to land a man on the moon. This was the beginning of the Saturn unmanned test flights and later the Apollo missions.
8 years later, the first manned mission to the moon, Apollo 11, was launched, carrying Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edward Aldrin. The success of this mission made a lasting impact on America by placing the United States ahead in the space race against the Soviet Union. 3 months later, the next mission, Apollo 12, was launched. It, along with Apollo 11, was successful. 6 months after Apollo 12, Apollo 13 was launched.
On April 11, 1970, at 1:13 p.m., the Apollo 13 mission was launched. It had left from the Kennedy Space Center in hopes of landing at the Fra Mauro area on the moon. The crew consisted of James A. Lovell Jr., the commander, Fred W. Hayes Jr., the lunar module pilot, and John L. Swigert Jr., the command module pilot.
I guess it's kind of interesting to know what the feelings are on a crew when something like this happens. When you first hear this explosion or bang, you don't know what it is. And we've had similar sounds in the spacecraft before that were for nothing. And then, to me, my impression was, as we came back, that we had an electrical problem that caused this bang, because in previous testing, we had some problems along these lines. That quickly went away, and I looked out the window and saw this venting, and my concern was increasing all the time. It went from, I wonder what this is going to do to the landing, to I wonder if we can get back home again.
After the successes of Apollo missions 11 and 12, 13 was set for success, but one passed over mistake ruined the chances of the mission achieving its goal of landing on the moon. The failure was caused by the number 2 oxygen tank, which was originally removed from the Apollo 10 mission for modification.
At 55 hours and 46 minutes into the Apollo 13 mission, 200,000 miles away from civilization, the Apollo 13 crew were stranded out in space with little hopes of survival. Due to this tragedy, the return was successful with the help of Mission Control in Houston, Texas.
The tragedy of Apollo 13 mission's failure to reach the moon was vital in order to promote the triumph of later missions because of the changes needed to the spacecraft, the new safety procedures implemented, and the wasted government fundings.
Apollo 13's failure was vital to the success of the later missions because of the technological improvements made to the space shuttle. These included the changing of the wiring in all of the tanks, removing the fans that were used to stir the tanks, and changing the tank heating units.
56 hours into the Apollo 13 mission, the exposed fan wires shorted and the Teflon insulation caught fire in the pure oxygen environment. The fire rapidly heated and increased the pressure of the oxygen inside the tank. This pressure spread through the wires into the electrical conduct in the side of the tank. The conduct ruptured under the pressure, provoking the number 2 oxygen tank to explode.
Because of this incident, NASA fixed and improved the spacecraft for Apollo 14 in several ways between April 11, 1970 and January 31, 1971. They removed the fans that were used to stir the tanks because the fan wire shorted, which caused the explosion. In addition, they also added a third cryogenic oxygen tank to the spacecraft, so if one were to fail, there would be others.
Additionally, they changed the wiring in all of the tanks to prevent the same shorting which made the original explosion. The tank heating units were also changed so that 3 separate elements could be operated individually. These changes were successful because the Apollo 14 mission reached its goal in collecting moon rocks. From these facts, one may conclude that the tragedy of Apollo 13 played an important part in ensuring the triumph of Apollo 14 and later missions by making several changes to the spacecraft.
The tragedy of the Apollo 13 mission failure was vital for the success of the later missions because of the new safety features implemented. The Mission Control Center monitored the mission from Houston, Texas. When the number 1 oxygen tank exploded, it made a hole in the command module. This explosion rendered the module uninhabitable and forced the crew of 3 into the 2-person lunar module.
Because the lunar module was designed to only carry 2 people, the oxygen supply was limited. The availability of lithium hydroxide for removing carbon dioxide, which the crew exhaled, was a problem. Therefore, the engineers advising the astronauts figured a way to provide the crew oxygen for the return using duct tape and other things accessible. This was crucial for the advancement of the Apollo program because between April 17, 1970 and January 31, 1971, NASA implemented drills in the staff's training for most of the emergency situations.
There are things you can't experience until they happen, but you can run simulations and training exercises. NASA trained and trained and trained. By January 31st, 1971, the preparation readied the Apollo 14 crew for anything. By having all their emergency drills ready to execute, it ensured the success of the mission. To conclude, the tragedy of Apollo 13 led to the triumph of the later missions by promoting new safety features.
The tragedy of Apollo 13 mission's failure was vital for the success of later missions because of the wasted government fundings. The wasted government fundings encouraged NASA to make the following mission successful. If they didn't succeed in the next mission, the funding would go down even more, and that would have caused Apollo missions to eventually end.
In 1970, when the Apollo 13 mission occurred, the government funding for NASA was decreasing. The Congress in 1970 and 1971 reduced NASA's fundings from $3,752 million to $3,382 million, which was a drop of $370 million. The drop in funding was caused by the failure of the mission because the government wouldn't want to fund an unsuccessful program because it would be wasting money. This means that there is a positive correlation in the funding dropping because of the failure of the mission.
In addition to the fundings dropping in 1971, they increased in 1972 from $3,382 million to $3,423 million, which was an increase in $41 million. The budget increased because of the success of the Apollo 14's mission. To conclude, the tragedy of Apollo 13's mission was important to the success of later missions because of the government fundings dropped in 1970. It encouraged NASA to make Apollo 14 a success.
With all things considered, the Apollo program improved from the disaster of the Apollo 13 mission by taking its errors and fixing them for the benefit of the later missions. The successes of Apollo missions 14, 15, 16, and 17 can be attributed to the failure of Apollo 13. When Apollo 14 launched in 1971, it was successful because it completed the mission of gathering more moon rocks for research.
The tragedy and the failure of Apollo 13 was important for the triumph of later missions because of the changes made to the spacecraft, the new safety procedures implemented, and the wasted government fundings. Tragedy makes the goal seem impossible, but then leads to triumph. Giving up should never be an option.